I'd like to welcome everyone to another Sunday afternoon class from the BYU Library Family History Center in Provo, Utah. Today we're going to be talking about finding your ancestors in land records. I guess I have a somewhat unique perspective in this since I was a trial attorney for 39 years, and most of the time I was involved in real estate law. So these documents are very, very, very familiar to me and all of the language. In fact, I could write the documents if I needed to. So we're going to just jump right into this. Kind of an admonition here. A thorough understanding of modern land law is impossible without a knowledge of its historical background. And this is from one of the textbooks that I had in law school, and it is the only textbook I kept because it actually gives a history of common law, real estate, real property, going back into the dark, Middle Ages, early times in England, where most of our common law came from. This is because that if it sounds like, and when you are trying to read a deed or any kind of land having to do with real property transactions or things like that, if it doesn't sound like it makes any sense, it's because without knowing the historical background, most of the meanings of the words that you're reading are no longer current meanings. The language has been preserved past the point where most people can understand the terminology. So this is just a situation where helping, as more you learn about the language, the more clarity you're going to get from the documents. And the last one is from Mr. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, who stated in a Supreme Court case, a page of history is worth a volume of logic. And if you think about that for a minute, what he's saying is that law isn't always logical. In fact, it seems to be predominantly illogical, but that's the way it is, and that's what the law is. And I had my own, and that is that doing genealogical research without a knowledge of history is like wandering in a forest without a compass or a map. And it always amazes me when I read about people getting lost in any area around one of the major cities in the Southwest, what I'm familiar with, is because if you're stuck until the night, and for example, from Phoenix, we were camping out away from the city, we could be 50, 100 miles from the city of Phoenix and see the entire glow in the sky and knew exactly where the town was from where we were. So I always felt it was pretty difficult. That seems to be happening. But let's say when we get into genealogy, it's even more important to know the history because the history you can just get off on the wrong tangent just almost without knowing it. Let's start with the whole concept here. And the concept is you need to start your search with the locations of the events in your ancestors' lives. That's the kind of the basic beginning of all genealogical research. We have a tendency to look at people's names, and because we have documents that are readily available, like census records and some of the vital records like birth, marriage, and death records, we have a tendency to search for names because we don't have to know the history of the world to find a census record. We just need to have to know a date and a person's name and maybe a place to start looking. But because the indexes are now indexing the whole documents, we really don't have to know much more than the name. But once you step away from that cozy little core of records that make you feel good real fast, if you get involved with them, you may be able to recognize that even if you found a name in a legal document, like a deed or a will, you may have a difficulty understanding what happened and who's who and what they did with the property. So we're going to talk a little bit about that and see what we can come up with. And this is the kinds of documents that we consider to be land records. And these are deeds, grantee, index, grantor, homestead, land partitions, leases, mortgages, patents, bounty land warrants, plats and maps, surveys, and water rights. So you're going to find these kinds of records all categorized by the genealogy catalogers as land and property records. You may come up with more records that apply also to the property that come out in probates and other kinds of court cases. But these are the ones that you would think of that are dealing directly with interests in real property and land. So that's the way that we look at that. And I would suggest that to be able to do some adequate research in land records, you'd need to know what all these were. So here's the simple way to do that today. If you're on your computer and you wanted to find out the definitions of every one of those records, the records in that list, let's assume that you're watching this video on YouTube or from the BYU Library website, the Library Family History Center website. And so you copy down this list. All you have to do is copy that down. Open one of the chat documents like ChatGPT or Google Gemini or Microsoft Copilot and just say, give me the definition of the following list of words, and then give a copy of the list to Gemini. And in about 2 seconds, you'll have a very nice explanation of each of those terms. That's kind of what we're doing. And I can kind of answer this question quick. The question is, are water rights a Western thing, or are they throughout the U.S. and in other countries? And the answer is water is always a thing. So no matter where you are in the world, you're going to be dealing with questions about water rights. It's a universal issue with humans. This is the key to know, and that is that in the United States, this is the United States that we'll focus on, deeds and other land records are usually found in individual counties' records. So we have in Texas here a fairly large number of counties. And as you move from county to county, or people did, you would need to start looking for land records in every place where the people may have lived. And it's interesting here in the United States, one thing that they list in many of the federal census records is tell you if your ancestors owned or rented land. If they did, you may be able to find a mention that they were a renter or an owner of property. Now, a rental agreement for land is still a land and property record. The problem with rental agreements is they weren't always done in writing, but they would, need to be in order to be really valid. But even if that, they're not usually recorded for the county. So you're just not going to find a lot of records of rental property, but it may help you to do the research on the actual property and see who the owner was, because the owner may be related to the person that you're researching. And if not, that may tell you something else also. Now, this is the key book to understanding law. There were only maybe 2 or 3 books, physical books, that I kept on my, what we call a credenza, that's behind the desk, sort of a cabinet that we had. And Black's Law Dictionary was always one of those books. This is just a compilation of all the legal terms with all the definitions. Now, the good news here is that down at the bottom, you can see an address to the website for the 9th edition of this particular book. And this is online and completely searchable, every word. So you can put in a legal term and use Black's Law Dictionary online to get definitions. You can sidetrack that with what I said just a few minutes ago, and that is, of course, Gemini, ChatGPT, and Copilot, and et cetera, have access to Black's Law Dictionary. So if you ask the question of Gemini or Copilot or ChatGPT, you probably get the answer directly out of Black's Law Dictionary. So it is available to search every single word. Here's kind of stepping back in history, and as I started out, we have to know quite a bit of history before land records, is in a general way, make any sense at all. So one thing that you might kind of need a little bit of reorienting to is that everything that happened in the history of our country, beginning with Jamestown in Virginia in the English, and Massachusetts with more English, and with the Spanish occupation and the French occupation and even the Russians. Everything that has to do with the United States is based on land and land promotion and subdividing land properties and selling it. And the more you know about land and the more you know about the history of the country, the more obvious it becomes that the whole driving force and what happened in the United States had to do with land ownership and land control. And so when you start thinking about history having to do with vast philosophical basis and religious and cultural basis and all of that, it all what it really comes down to is who owned the land, who controlled the land, and how that land control was transferred. So we had England. The question was England owned the land or claimed it, and there was a war fought, the Revolutionary War, and ownership of the property was changed over to individuals or governments. And as we go across the United States in the history, that's the history of it. So, how do we begin to understand what we're looking at with land and property records? Well, that's pretty much at the core of learning. And if you learn this part of the land history, then you have a good kind of understanding of what you're looking at when you read a deed or when you get into historical issues of land. And what happens here is that there are two different parts of the United States on the way that land ownership is recorded and the way that it's divided up. So here in the East, we have what's called the state land system. And state land states are the ones listed over here on the right, beginning with Connecticut and ending up with West Virginia. If you think in terms of the original colonies and their extensions of claims over to approximately the Mississippi River or the Ohio River in the north, or the boundaries as they exist with Canada or Mexico, then what you have is the state lands. And those are characterized by what we call meets and bounds. Those are a land description in a state land system will start off at a known point. It could be a tree, could be a barn, it could be a mark on the ground. And they say going a certain direction, a certain distance, turning to the north, going another direction, and so forth. And so they're describing as if you were walking around the property and actually had all of those different landmark things to view. The problem with the whole system is that the landmarks were transient. They were barns and trees get cut down, barns burned down or get moved. And oh, by the way, if you've never seen a barn move, believe me, barns do get moved. So that's called the state land system. The reality in the present day is that all of those properties have now been surveyed and that the surveys are recorded. And so the survey itself, which is also the description of the perimeter of the land, is what's on record. And so understanding how to read state land, state description is one of the things that is basic to understanding land property. The rest of the country, was based on a system called federal land states. And the federal land states have a point of origin. And then they began setting out survey lines. And the survey lines would then be extended north, south, and east and west from the given point. So that's why if you look at these in the land system in the western part of the United States, beginning at the Ohio River and the Mississippi River, then you get little blocks of land all over. And this one is easier to understand because it's very uniform across the country. And it depends, of course, on these different colored surveys. So the different colors show different surveys. Down in Arizona, where I spent most of my time, there were two. One was a survey of almost the entire state of what's there now. And the second one was a little block up in the northeast corner of this, towards the northeast corner of the state, which happened to cut our property in half. So half of our property was on the north side of that survey, and the other was in the other survey. That meant that lines between property owners were off by about a quarter of a mile. So that was one thing that you had to learn in that particular area. And this is called the Public Land Survey System. And the states that have this are called federal land states. And the reason is that the United States government claimed all of the Western lands. So there was no question about who owned the lands. It was owned by the government. And then they began systematic sales of that land through homesteads, bounty land grants, just land grants in general, and transfers of property from the federal government to the state governments, or claims from the states that were finally determined to be ownership of the states. So here's a diagram of a metes and bounds description of a property. There's two things here, and the word is metes, M-E-T-E-S, and bounds, just like bounds, B-O-U-N-D-S. The bounds are the ownerships on one side of the property line, and the metes are the distances between the landmark points. So you're basically walking around the property in a clockwise fashion, and you're getting a description of how far you go straight until you make a turn. And if you reach a point and turn, then you go a certain more distance and then tell the turn. So each one of those is a distance and has a particular direction involved with it. And you can tell that there has to be, in a lot of cases, some disagreement, because if two different people measure the land, they're likely to come up with two different descriptions. And in one case that I was involved with a number of years ago, we had a dispute between two adjacent landowners, and we went out and got a survey, and then they demanded a survey. And so we got that. And then neither of those two surveys agreed. So they went out and got a third survey, and there was still no agreement. And that case was sitting in court, and I went to teach a continuing legal education session, and half of the people that showed up, in quite a bit, I was very, very surprised, because usually I only had a few dozen, maybe a dozen or 2 dozen people. I had a whole place full of people, and they all turned out to be people from the title companies wondering how in the world my lawsuit was going to ever get settled with the three different surveys. So that's sort of the things that you get involved with when you start looking at these property borders. The public land survey is, like I said, pretty straightforward. It starts out with a principal meridian and a baseline, north and south line, and an east and west line. And then the acreage of grids is a grid of 36 square miles. And these numbers are simply arbitrary. They were done based on the English measurement system, and you have to just memorize what it is. There's no no logic to it, is a sense. So you have square miles marked off, then they were divided into 1 square mile blocks, and then those blocks of 640 acres were further subdivided down. So your description is going to come out something like this: the northwest quarter of the southwest quarter of the east of the northeast quarter of township and range of the measurement. And the townships all have numbers, and the range is the survey system that is being used. So there's the kind of the quick one of that. If that it probably doesn't mean a lot of sense, and you might say, why in the world would I want to know that about this if I'm doing genealogical research? And the answer might come down to whether or not you could absolutely identify the person that you're looking for when you have to know exactly where they lived as opposed to where someone else lived. And so that may turn out to be a crucial factor in you're making any kind of headway. And it's also helpful because if you know where all the land was that your ancestor was basically using, then you have a lot more indications of records that could be found. And when we have what we have now with full text search, all those old deeds and documents are becoming more and more available. And as long as that continues, we may end up finding and resolving a lot of the problems and challenges that we've had previously. Kind of the go-to place at this point is the Family Search Research Wiki. And the wiki gets into this pretty, there's a lot of information and a lot of links out to how all of this works and how the land and ownership, property ownership works. You can go here to United States Land and Property in the wiki and begin that process of understanding all of the different kinds of records and what they might mean. It's supplemented with Black's Law Dictionary and looking the names up in a good chatbot like ChatGPT or Gemini or Copilot will give you a good leg up here. And you can say the same thing I would suggest. This isn't just another page from the Research Wiki, Family Search Research Wiki. And this is one, as you can see, it's the United States land and property and then United States deeds. So this is within the land and property. And this will give you, this page on the wiki will give you a further description of and how it worked. Now, I've mentioned full text a number of times, and one thing about anything that has to do with AI, which is what this does, is that you're going to come up with a number of changes. And the changes in this case, I was discussing briefly before the presentation here, but the ideas of full text and the way that it's doing transcriptions of handwriting and then a way to search every word in the document, that has been changing, let's call it weekly. So here, if you do a full text search, and I just used it, I'm using this now as an example of not just the full text search, but an example of the kinds of information that you can get out of deeds and the other records. So in this case, I did a search for deeds and got a whole bunch of deeds. That's all that I ended up getting. One thing that did happen, though, in the last couple of weeks from the date of this particular presentation is that full text search was moved to the search tab from the lab's experiment. It's no longer an experiment. It's part of the main website on Family Search. So if you click on the search tab up there, Family Search, Family Tree, Search Memories, and Get Involved Activities, then the second item on that list will be full text search. And you'll be jumping off into looking into all of these, what you would call legal documents and all sorts of things that perhaps no one generally ever searches because there's no organization and no indexes. So now there's a way to jump into these documents and get all of the information. So here's your full text search link presently. Actually, the first documents that were processed by Family Search included all of their records for deeds and probate files. And there was incentive to do that and put the deeds was that these were the largest collections of records on Family Search where there had been no headway made in doing indexing because it was too much to index every name in every document. And so this was kind of a backwater of what was available on Family Search and other websites. So now if they, as they implement these full text search and handwriting recognition documents, what they've done is opened up this vast number of records that haven't been readily or even in some cases available at all to most people and most researchers. And here's a way it can happen. Now, here's a general index to deeds, grantees, and that means people who received the land. In other words, the buyer of the property. And the grantor would be the person who sold the property. So this is the standard deed index that would have been kept by, in this case, Navajo County in Arizona. And so looking through this, I was simply did a search for my surname as Tanner. And the reason I did that, of course, is because part of my family came from northern Arizona. And so I realized I assumed that my name would show up over and over again. And that was true. It did. So what you get when you do this full text search is that you get what you asked for. And here I asked for Tanners, and it highlighted every Tanner on this record and every other record that was in that particular collection. And you'll notice there's 135 images here in this collection. And it searched all of them in about 1 second or 2 seconds and came up with highlighting the Tanner name in every single one of those 135 documents. So you're really getting a lot more than you asked for from the full text search sometimes. And this is just a standard deed that I found for my great grandfather, and my great grandfather. And this is just that's what you would find in a standard deed. And over here on the right hand side, you're going to see a list of names. Those are the people that are all mentioned in this deed in various ways. And so using this deed, we have picked up Henry, who's my grandfather, is one of his wives, Eliza, Reuben Parkinson, who is Eliza's brother, Martin Ray Tanner, who's a cousin, and Thomas William Tanner, who is a cousin. And Alan Frost, McAllister, and McLaws are all the people who are processing these documents. In other words, the county employees. So we have names. And why would we worry about the county employees? They may turn out to be relatives also. And they may also figure somehow into what was happening back here in 1895. And this is an indenture. This means it's an encumbrance on the property. Somebody's mortgaging a property back and forth or creating some kind of limitation on the property or selling part of the property. And it was signed on the 16th of March of 1895. Well, that happens to be before the formation of Navajo County, but you'll notice that if you looked carefully at this record, you'd see that it was recorded in Navajo County. And it wasn't until the 21st of March that Navajo County was formed. But then, because of those dates, this document was actually signed in Apache County because Navajo County was carved off of Apache County. So here's where we start talking about history, and here's where we start talking about how history affects the documents. and affects where we're going to be able to find this document. Now, why was the document found in Navajo County? Because it wasn't filed, and even though it was signed in Apache County, it wasn't filed and recorded until 1903 in Navajo County after it was formed. So even though it was signed in Apache County, it ended up being recorded in Navajo County. This is the big player. If I mentioned at the beginning, the federal government took over most of the land, or almost all the land in the western part of the country. So over the period of time that the federal government had control from the time of the end of the revolution and signing of the Constitution and the acquisition and development of the property, the government began what was called the General Land Office. And the General Land Office job was to sell off the land or give the land away in a sense. And so these records of the Bureau of Land Management and the Department of the Interior are called the GLO records or General Land Office records. And these GLO records note the original person who homesteaded the property or acquired the property by purchase from the government or whatever. And so this is a huge index that's online. You can get to the index by looking up. It's called BLM. So it's the BLM GLO, and that'll get you to these land records. Here's a document recording the information of a homestead patent from my great grandfather. When we call it a patent, that's just the word they use for this. It's not a patent that has to do with inventions or anything. It means that the land was legally conveyed and it was done by proper procedures and authority. And so it was done in a way that could be relied upon by future purchasers of the property. And here you see it's ostensibly signed by the President of the United States. There's been a little bit of news around the country today in the last few year or so about automatic signing machines, and those have been employed by federal officials for a long time. So we don't really know if Calvin Coolidge signed this document personally, probably not. So here's the description of the property and the date that my grandfather obtained the property. This is helpful information. Now, one of the things about doing the land and property research, has to do with records. Records and genealogical records are organized and located by the location of their creation. So knowing that Henry had this particular piece of property heavily implies that there are other documents out there that talk about Henry and his family. And so this is kind of like one way of getting into the records that are available throughout all the storage places and everything. Because you have a place and time in which somebody owned a piece of property, then you can start out with school records. You could go to survey records and all the irrigation records in Arizona and things like that. Here's kind of a blow up of the description that you can see here. Now, this is what's interesting. Using a program called Google Earth, which is sort of the big brother, big sister of Google Maps, Google Earth is organized to recognize the state land and metes and bounds descriptions. So if you use one of these programs, the one that's mentioned here is called EarthPoint. And if you go to EarthPoint and enter in that information that was on that land patent that we just looked at, and here's the URL for EarthPoint. It's earthpoint.us. And from there, you can go to townships, and that gives you this BLM, township and range description. You simply fill in the information from that, and it goes in and locates the property on the ground and shows you the property with an outline and then marks it. So there's that property that was given to Henry as a result of a homestead application and a patent from the federal government. And if you're careful and you understand what you're looking at a little town called Joseph City, which is just off the picture here to the right. And you got a yellow line that goes there, and that's Interstate 40 going across Arizona. Another way of getting land in lots of different ways in the United States, besides just purchase, is through a bounty land transfer. And that was based on service to the United States during early times, particularly during the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812, when the government had a lot of land and no money. And so they began to give away land instead of money. Well, what happened is that these certificates for a land, in this case 160 acres, became like currency or like stock. You could buy or sell these certificates. And it's possible, and it happened, is that at one point in time, I was asked about a piece of property that was purchased in 1930, almost 100 years after bounty land warrants were issued. And they had purchased the property with a bounty land warrant. And of course, the person who had that come up wanted to know where that came from. And so that's how I got involved because they asked me how that worked. So bounty land warrants were certificates to eligible veterans, and they had free land in the public domain. So they could go out and choose a property as just in the area which was up to, and they received property depending on their rank in the Army, Navy, whatever. So in the official government service. And there became like a trade, like a stock market on these. A lot of the veterans would said, I'd rather have the money than the land because I've already got the land. So then they would sell these warrants off. So they were issued by the veterans of the U.S. Revolutionary War between 1789 and 1833, and veterans of the War of 1812 between 1815 and 1858. So if you never looked for it, you may find out that you're a person who fought in the Civil War, in the Revolutionary War, War of 1812, got one of these warrants, and it may have used the warrant to buy land. So that might get you going. Another thing that Google Earth recognizes are GIS, or Geographic Information Systems. Many of the maps that you're going to see, the historical maps about counties in the United States, are based on this Geographic Information Service, or GIS maps. And you may see that as you begin to look. And here in Utah, and particularly here in Utah Valley, where Brigham Young University is located, you can see the entire history, the title history of a parcel, any parcel, by clicking on the map and zooming in. And because they are connected to this GIS system, which is a programming system, then all of the boundaries are programmed. This gets to be very crucial if you're trying to work with adjoining landowners, because if you zoom in on this, you may find that the border of the land between you and your neighbor has not been correctly defined by a fence or a tree or whatever. So this is one way to see how the properties were. And if you understand in the context of doing genealogical research, that this can become very, very important because you'll be able to trace back the ownership of property. Now, this doesn't work every place, but it's a very commonly used system throughout the country. So here's what it looks like when you're looking at a GIS map. On the right, you have the major subdivisions of the land in that part of Arizona. There's the freeway that we were just looking at, and I centered this sort of on Joseph City, Arizona. And so it was up there on the freeway. It could have been on Holbrook or Winslow, I don't know, but it came up. Okay, and then on the left-hand side is a more defined ad. And as you zoom in on that map, you'll see that it gives you each of the parcels of property as they exist. And in this case, it gives you the owner and then a map and more information. And then there's a parcel detail, a parcel report, a tax report, and property information map, which give you basically the history of the ownership of that piece of property. Now, if you find this to be the case in the place where you're looking, you need to know enough that it exists so that you can ask the questions and get in online and look and find this information. And it's invaluable for defining who owns a piece of property and when it was purchased and when it was sold. So this is kind of an interesting piece of property. So you can really kind of track your ancestors across the countries of the all across the states in the United States because the land ownership and land, and even if they were renting land and could be something that would provide information back and forth about exactly where they were. And it may clarify a lot of other issues that are involved. Now, one reason, for example, is I go back in my own Tanner family line to Rhode Island is how do I determine if I've got the right person going back there when there are a number of people named William Tanner, is that we know the property of where they lived because of the property was given to children, and so we have a line of children that identify this person who can't further be identified yet. But as we get more and more information from these full text searches, we may very well be able to have more of a concrete identification. This is called a cadastral map. It shows property ownership on a map of the counties of Orleans, Lamoille, and Essex in Vermont. And I don't think that's how they say Lamoille in Mobile or whatever in Vermont, but I don't know how they say it. But that's the counties. And why are these important is because when you get into the cadastral maps, which are all over the country, you can show it shows the extent, value, and ownership of the lands, and they're made for taxation purposes. And what they look like when they're actually on the ground is this, and this is a cadastral survey marker from the National Forest Service in Rock Canyon, east of Provo, Utah. So this is about a quarter of a mile or so from this survey marker from my house up the canyon. And I thought it was interesting that the cadastral survey had included the canyon there. And the reason why is because originally it was privately owned, and originally there was a road through the canyon, and originally there was mining interests in the canyon, all of which have been now put into national forest and Provo city control. So there's a lot more to learn here. And you look at this mountain of books, you think about the time it took me to go through law school 3 years normally. I did it in 2.5. And after 2.5 years, I had pretty well stuffed my head full of information, I thought. And I found out that I was still learning when I finally retired from law 39 years later. So it's a process. It's not immediate. You can ask questions now online, as I've mentioned a couple of times. You can get help from other people who are available. The BYU Library Family History Center just recently increased the time coverage of their virtual help system. We have a virtual online Zoom that by going to the BYU Library Family History Center, you can get more information or learn more and talk directly to people in the library, no charge, free, no time limit kind of thing. And so there are ways to get this information and get more information about it. But as I mentioned, as we were going along, Research Wiki on the family search is a good way to get started. It gives you a good overview. It gives you links out to a lot of information. And in addition to that, just starting to ask the chatbots some information. Okay, well, thanks for watching. The question came up, when did the government stop issuing these old land documents where they issued in every state? Okay, homestead and land and the two document types I talked about. One was bounty land property. So the land bounty certificates were given to veterans. So that's only during the time periods that I mentioned in the presentation. Homestead evolved primarily from around the time of the Civil War into as late as the 1960s in Alaska. So we're talking about a process here, and it changed constantly. The requirements and the availability and what was available as home to for homestead and what wasn't available. So you will see things like here with the deed for the Tanners in around the turn of the century and from 1800s to the 1900s. You'll see homesteads, but that's because Arizona and some of the other states were the last places that people could get homestead property. And no, they weren't issued. Well, the bounty land owners had the process had nothing to do with states as such. They were given a federal land wherever it was located. So you get bounty land warrants in Ohio and Virginia and West Virginia, and I mean you get them all over the country. Anything that the government owned that they wanted to sell because they needed money was subject to homestead. Huge long history, a lot of changes, and pretty complicated. One of the more complicated string of federal changes. Every time there was even a partially change in the U.S. legislature, the one thing they rewrote was a homestead.
So, James, there's one more question, and that was what docs would have been issued between the Civil War, between 1810 and the Civil War?
Okay, well, the General Land Office and the government was still open to selling land. You could sell it. So there was no reason not to sell it. So you could find a land property that was sold to by the government prior to that time. And it's also possible that the states could have taken some of the land from the government when they were formed, and the government could have transferred a certain amount of land to the state when the state was created. So there's lots of different ways of attaining the property. But what we're talking about primarily here is personal ownership of property. So we're not so worried about what the state lands own and all that. We're more worried about where our guys got the property and where they had their farm or where they had their ranch.